So the summer flying season is back again, and I've started getting lots of requests from people to help with aviation French, particularly when you go to an airfield in France, as is quite often the case, and it says FR only on the chart, generally when it's an uncontrolled airfield, so without any kind of air traffic services. So in this short video, I want to lay out a little bit the situation regarding these kinds of airfields and how pilots can deal with operating into and out of certain airfields when they have language restrictions. So here we go. Okay, so the first thing we need to think about is the regulatory background to language proficiency in aviation. Now, contrary to what people think, English is not the only language in aviation. When we want to think about the languages that can be used in the air, we need to think about the EASA regulations, if we're flying in Europe, and also any national regulations which might impose different rules when you're flying in a certain country. So in France, as far as language use goes, under the EASA regulations, which are FCL 55, they state that a pilot license cannot be valid unless it has at least one language proficiency endorsement on it, and that language proficiency endorsement can be either English or the language for the country in which the flight is being conducted. So in practice, if you're flying in France, as long as your license has either minimum level 4 English on it or minimum French level 4 on it, you're good to go. You can fly in France to start with. Once we've looked at the European regulations, which say that if we've got level 4 English, regardless of whatever other languages we have, we can fly in France, we now then need to start looking at what the French national regulations say. And the French national regulations relating to radio telephony say that the languages accepted for use in France are English or French, except if an aeronautical publication says otherwise. So in reality, when is an aeronautical publication going to say otherwise? Well, in reality, the only time it's going to say otherwise is going to be if the chart of the airfield that you're landing on, next to the frequency, be it FISO or A/A or air-to-air, or sometimes called Unicom, when there's nobody on the frequency, if it in brackets it says FR only, meaning that only French can be used. Now this is important because used doesn't mean qualified, because if we go back to the European regulations say that in order to be legal you have to have English or the language of the country where you're flying. So there is nothing to stop you, if you've only got English on your license, from landing at an airfield where it says FR only on the chart. However, in order to comply with that regulation, you do have to use French. Now, using French is entirely different from being qualified in French. So the next question I often get asked is, where can I take a French exam to get it put on my license from whatever country it comes from? There are two ways of taking an actual French exam to gain an ICAO language proficiency endorsement of level 4 in French. You can either go to the French DGAC in one of their exam centres, and they will organise an exam for you on demand, or you can go to the Swiss Aviation Authority in Lausanne, and they will also organise for you to do an exam. So if you actually do speak French to a reasonable level, and you want to go and get yourself an actual language proficiency endorsement, you can go to Lausanne, or you can go to one of the French DGAC testing centres. Bearing in mind that you do require a fairly proficient level of French in order to get an actual exam. However, most of the requests that I get about speaking French on the radio are not from pilots who have a reasonable level of French and actually want to get a qualification. They generally come from non-French speaking pilots who perhaps have a few ideas about basic French words, can perhaps order a beer in a restaurant or whatever, and who want to be able to do the basic radio messages when landing at uncontrolled airfields, so where it says A/A on the chart in France, or air-to-air, sometimes known as Unicom airfields. So the rest of this video is going to be it's going to talk about how you can make yourself understood and comply with the FR only regulation if you find yourself having to land at an airfield where it says FR only. I will also say that it would be pretty silly to try and talk to ATC using the things that I'm going to show you, because in reality ATC, as everywhere, are all English qualified. So the things I'm going to show you in this video are really just for the absolute basics. So I have seen on various websites pilots who share what's been termed a crib sheet, which is basically a list of basic messages that they can say on the radio and at least make themselves understood. The problem with some of these crib sheets that I've seen is that they contain really, really long-winded, complicated messages which try to mimic what real French pilots say when they're flying sort of in French in the course of a normal flight. The problem with trying to do this for somebody who doesn't really speak French is that when you're having to manage the aeroplane at the same time, you're going to forget most of it, and what you're trying to say is going to be pretty much unintelligible. So what I've tried to do in this short guide is I have tried to really reduce the content of the messages to make them as simple to remember as possible. So let's have a little look. Okay, so a couple of basic principles we need to master before we start. First thing to do is to learn the numbers 1 to 36 in French. 1 to 36, why? Because obviously we have the runway numbers that go from 01 to 36. So I'm not going to spend time telling you how to say the numbers 1 to 36 in French. I'm sure everybody's capable of doing that. But what I will say is that when we pronounce runway numbers in French, generally, they are given as whole numbers rather than individual digits. So, for example, runway 25, as we would say in English, would actually be runway 25. Runway 24 would be runway 24, and so on and so forth. Okay, the next thing that we need to do is we need to learn some basic key words. Now, in ordinary French RT, we would use verbs to explain what we're doing or what we're requesting to do. Again, somebody who doesn't really have a very strong grasp of French is going to use up a lot of mental energy trying to think how to conjugate verbs. So what I've done is I've taken the verbs and I've actually just turned them into actions. So what are the things that we can do on the ground? Bearing in mind that we don't need to give, particularly at uncontrolled airfields, which is where we're going to be using this phraseology, we don't need to give a lot of information. We just need to give pilots who are listening to the frequency a general idea of what we're doing and signal the fact that we are there. So what's the first thing that we would do that someone needs to know about would probably be to taxi. So the verb to taxi in French is rouler. But again, we don't need to think about conjugating the verb. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the noun which denotes the act of taxiing, which is roulage. The next one we're going to talk about is when we get to the holding point. So when we get to the holding point, generally we line up on the runway. So to line up in French is actually what we call a reflexive verb, is s'aligner. But again, we're not going to spend time thinking about conjugation. So rather than saying s'aligner, we're going to use the word alignement. Alignement just means the act of lining up. Next one, décoller is the verb to take off. So we're going to use the word which means a takeoff, the noun. So we're going to go for décollage. And then thinking about coming the other way when we're going to join the circuit and we're coming in from somewhere else. At that point, what we need to learn are the basic words for joining the circuit. So first time we call, we would say, for example, we are inbound to yourselves or something along those lines. The word for arrival in French is arriver. So we're going to learn the word arriver, which means arrival. And then after that, we're going to learn the last word that we're going to learn for things that we do with the aeroplane is going to be intégration. Intégration means join. So the verb in French to join is s'intégrer. And then we're going to use the word intégration. Intégration, which just means a join, the act of joining. Okay, next thing that we need to think about learning are the legs of the circuit. So the legs of the circuit are, for the upwind, we would say montée initiale. For the crosswind, we would say vent traversier. For the downwind, we would say vent arrière. It's actually vent arrière, but we link the two words together as if it was one word, so you would say vent arrière. Base is just base, and final is just finale. So just to recap the basic words that we need roulage, alignement, décollage, arrivée, intégration. And then for the circuit legs, we need montée initiale, vent traversier, vent arrière, base, and finale. So with a handful of words, we can now take this really basic methodology and see what we can do with it in real situations. Okay, so let's begin with something really, really basic. So we're going to imagine that we are at the apron and we want to take off from a given runway. So I'm going to start with my really basic radio message to let everybody know that I'm going somewhere. So I'm just going to say my call sign and then what I'm doing with the basic words that we've just seen. So Foxtrot, Zulu, Golf, Echo, Golf, roulage 03. So now I'm at the holding point and I'm going to announce that I'm lining up on the runway. So Foxtrot, Zulu, Golf, Echo, Golf, alignement 03. So now here I am taking off. So I've set my power, I'm off down the runway and I'm going to say Foxtrot, Zulu, Golf, Echo, Golf, décollage 03. Okay, so moving on to the arrival. So we need a tiny little bit more vocabulary for this one. We need to know the words for north, west, south and east. So nord, west, sud and est. And in this particular situation, we're doing a very simplified message to let other traffic know that we're arriving from the east and we'll be overhead in 5 minutes. So we can simplify that down to simply Foxtrot, Zulu, Bravo, Uniform, Bravo, arrivée est, verticale dans 5 minutes. So now obviously the logical next step is to be overhead the airfield and announce that we're going to join the circuit. So in this particular situation, we could say something like Foxtrot, Zulu, Bravo, Uniform, Bravo, verticale, intégration 36. So moving swiftly on, we're now downwind for runway 36. So we would just announce our position again. Foxtrot, Zulu, Bravo, Uniform, Bravo, vent arrière 36. So now we're on final. So we're going to announce that we're on final. So Foxtrot, Zulu, Bravo, Uniform, Bravo, finale 36. So there we have a very simplified, basic way of approaching very simple, basic radio messages in French for uncontrolled airfields. Now, I'm sure there are some purists who are going to watch this video and who are going to say to me, well, you shouldn't have made this video because it's going to cause a danger, it's going to encourage pilots to go to French-only airfields and put themselves in danger because they can't understand what's going on, etc., etc. There is an argument for that, and I can understand what the argument for that is, but in reality, whether I make this video or not, non-French speaking pilots are still going to land at French-only airfields for a variety of reasons. So if they are going to do it, I think it's far better that they have at least some basic knowledge so they can make themselves understood in those kind of situations. If you look at the links underneath this video or above this video, depending on where you watch it, I've put my idiot-proof guide to French radio as a link, which you can download. Obviously, it's free for everyone to use. Keep in the plane with you. And I'm always happy to answer any questions anyone might have if you want to get in contact via lingero.com. Safe flights to all, and bye-bye. Take care.